Hello, and welcome to This Week in Sociological Perspective. I'm your host, Samuel Roundfield Lucas. This week, I spoke with Professor Kathryn Freeman Anderson of the University of Houston about the causes and implications of the slow return of passengers to public transportation in the wake of COVID. But first, I recently spoke with Professor Eunmi Mun of the University of Illinois about her recent paper titled Meritocracy at Work, Merit-Based Reward Systems and Gender Wage Inequality. The paper is to be published in Social Forces and is co-authored by Naomi Kodama. Professor Mun, thank you for talking with us today.
Thank you very much for having me today.
So, your paper asks whether merit-based reward systems, that pay people based on their productivity, equalize pay between men and women. To clarify, to get it started, what approaches fall into the category of merit-based reward systems? Oh, not all of them, but just because I'm sure there might be dozens, but just to get a sense of what we're talking about, some examples would be helpful.
So merit-based pay systems that have been widely diffused and become very popular in many workplaces across high-income countries these days mostly are based on performance reviews or performance evaluations. So we have a certain kind of test that we are supposed to perform in. And then the managers, for example, or supervisors in any kind of function will review the productivity of the employees and then write a review and discuss how well the expectations have been met and how highly the employee's performance can be, how high the performance was during the set period of time, and then give scores, said high performer, middle performer, or low performer, things like that. There are various types of performance review scales companies use, both quantitative and qualitative kind of reviews. And then based on the performance reviews, pay is determined.
So why, that seems like a pretty straightforward process. Why theoretically might we think merit-based systems would lower gender inequality?
Well, the interesting part of the whole story, or the tricky part of the story underlying the diffusion of merit-based pay systems, is that the expectation was initially that merit-based pay systems will be an equalizer. So it will decrease and reduce the gender gap, because for a long time, particularly before the merit-based system was introduced, there was not a clear performance evaluation criteria. A huge room for discretion, and managers could actually insert a lot of biases, in-group favoritism, all kinds of other kind of non-merit-based beliefs that they could use when they evaluate employees, because there is no set formalized criteria they had to follow. They did not really have to spell out what are the kind of things that they evaluate and how they evaluated certain areas of performance that employees produce, and employees' productivity and performance and things like that. So interestingly, the idea that having formalized performance review processes and formalized processes of distributing resources, basically payment, resources to employees based on the kind of clearly defined criteria was understood as a kind of important means to rule out biases or all other types of non-merit-based interferences into resource distribution, basically payment system. So the idea was that it'll be a good thing for the equality supporters, that women who have been discriminated against or unfairly treated, or in kind of male-dominant workplaces, women have been considered as low performers without actually clearly defined criterion or review processes. This merit-based system will actually help reduce gender pay gap. So that was the underlying idea.
So that seems pretty clear. So why would someone doubt theoretically? I mean, is there some theory that would say that wouldn't happen? Like, for example, would someone contend that, well, it's not going to reduce the gender gap in pay because the genders differ in productivity. So if you make the productivity, if you make it all about productivity, then the pay's not going to equalize. I mean, why would someone think it wouldn't? Is there some theory or a set of theories that would explain why it wouldn't equalize under merit-based reward systems?
Well, the sad story is that once the payment system shifts, once merit-based payment systems got widely popularized and diffused, scholars started observing kind of unintended or unexpected kind of consequences to merit-based systems. I mean, the idea that individuals should be rewarded based on their merit and non-merit factors, like in-group favoritism biases, should not determine payment seems like a straightforward idea. But having an idea or belief system of meritocracy is one thing. How that idea gets implemented at the workplace is another. There are many different kinds of merit-based systems across all kinds of workplaces. Some workplaces decided to adopt a merit-based payment system, but they decide to have it only for a small component of their compensation. Some companies decided to do it, but they gave a lot of discretionary room to managers to evaluate. They did not have a centralized system or standardized system. They still gave a pretty huge room for managers to decide who is a better performer than others. So there is a lot of idiosyncrasies that emerged in terms of the implementation of merit-based systems across many workplaces. So that is one thing. And a lot of scholars who started analyzing personnel data from an organization, they started witnessing the way performance evaluation is conducted. We say performance evaluation, in a sense, it should be objective. It should follow the criteria and all that. But they still saw that biases still determine pretty significantly men's and women's evaluations. Managers tend to give lower performance evaluation scores to women than men. That was a pretty consistent observation. Even when they use exactly the same kind of clearly defined objective criteria and all that, still women tend to get lower performance scores. And even when performance scores were very similar, even identical, the amount of wages, rewards that were given to the equally performing men and women did not always look exactly the same. Women tend to be awarded less money than equally performing men, meaning men who got exactly the same performance scores. So there were many paths that they will still be very susceptible to biases. So having a formalized performance review system did not necessarily rule out all kinds of biases and in-group favoritism. So that has been pretty much consistent kind of findings in this literature about merit-based payment system.
So in your paper, you're studying this merit-based rewards systems in Japan. Did companies in Japan adopt merit-based systems in an effort to address gender inequality in pay?
So it's an interesting context to study. We are talking about a country of lifetime employment. Japan is famous for a very long-term employment. That's why it's called lifetime employment. It still is the case that employees do not really change their employers too often in Japan. Once they get hired, they're expected to be loyal and stay with the same employer for a long, long time. And the way people have careers is sort of through internal promotion system because they stay with the same employer for a long time. They get trained internally and they get promoted internally. So for that, to sort of maintain the very strong internal labor market and give incentive to employees to stay long-term, seniority-based payment system has been very strongly established within the Japanese labor market in Japanese organizations. Switching from the seniority-based payment system to the merit-based payment system was not an easy deal in that kind of context. And there was a lot of resistance. And it did not come because employers were interested in gender equality or reducing gender inequality. They started making the shift in the late 1990s because the once highly praised Japanese labor market system, Japanese way of doing business based on lifetime employment, stability, and things like that got highly criticized as Japanese economy got into a long-term stagnation starting from 1990s. So once the engine of economic miracle, like lifetime employment, seniority-based payment, and a lot of stability and things like that, now are criticized as obstacles to sort of getting adjusted to quickly changing global economy, changing economic conditions and things like that. So that's when broadly labor market reforms started. And one of the components of the reform was switching from seniority-based system to merit-based system. So the merit-based reward systems did not emerge as a way to address inequality issues, not at all. It was considered as a way to sort of rationalize payment system, reward high performers more, and somehow give more incentive people to work more and be more productive through switching compensation system.
So now you are studying in a paper, the analysis is of hourly wages, bonuses, and total compensation. Why the three different outcomes?
Well, one quick answer to that is probably because I have all the data. I wanted to test how the shifting of compensation system influenced different components of compensation packages. But that's one thing. More importantly, is that what I've been quite interested in is this huge idiosyncrasy or heterogeneity in the way merit-based systems are implemented across workplaces. The way, the title is the same, merit-based pay system. And there can be different kind of systems that were developed and promoted, but the idea was exactly the same kind of thing. We're gonna reward individuals based on their merit and performance. But some organizations took it as something really important. They really switched the payment system from seniority to completely performance-based. 100% of the pay should be based on performance. Some other companies were a lot more hesitant. They thought that efforts should be also considered as an important part of compensation. I mean, people who are trying hard need to be compensated. Performance is not always too easy to measure. There are all kinds of question marks about how to measure performance and things like that. So they limited the amount, the size of compensation that will be due to individual merit and performance. It's just 20%, some kind of small portion of the total compensation. So I mean, there's a huge variation in terms of how performance is actually incorporated into the payment system across workplaces. So just looking at only one outcome, one part of the component of compensation, I thought wouldn't actually give us the broad picture of the impact of the performance pay system change, So that was one motivation that I had. And the more I learned about how payment systems, how merit-based pay systems are implemented, also gave a kind of big question mark basically in terms of how we can sort of measure or gauge the impact of merit-based payment system when we are looking at only one organization. this one organization's way of measuring performance, this one organization's decision to have how much of weight for individual performance should be given in compensation. So we are basically measuring this one organization's decision about how to deal with kind of individuals' merit in compensation. There's a huge variation in terms of how important performance is in compensation across organizations. So if I looked at only one component, that could be problematic. And some companies took performance evaluation as something really strictly kind of organized. They have to follow specific processes to measure individuals in performance. Some other companies just let managers have kind of a lot of discretionary room, in a sense. It's like a loose criteria. If it is a team-based structure of a workplace, it's a team performance. Individual performance is not too clear-cut, easy measure. So in that case, the team head has a lot of discretionary room in determining how important this one individual's contribution was to the team performance and all that. So all kinds of consideration, basically, in terms of the way organizations deal with performance in their compensation, and how performance is measured across organizations. There are all kinds of differences and variations. So that consideration made me think that I will probably need to investigate the impact of this organizational level shift in compensation system to merit-based pay, merit-based reward system on all possible components of compensation, so that I can actually have a better sense of broad picture of the impact of payment system change.
So you're studying not one organization though, but 400. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So it's comparing across. So and within. So what did you find with these different aspects of compensation?
So one thing that I kind of expected to find, and then I found, was that the component of compensation that is most tightly connected to the performance, the bonus component of it, was the most sensitive to the switching of organizational policy towards merit-based system. So companies that have adopted merit-based reward systems tended to show larger gender gap in bonus. That's one finding, sort of following the literature that sort of sensed this continuation of gender biases in payment. Since shifting to the merit-based pay didn't really reduce gender inequality, and paradoxically, it also kind of increased gender inequality in the component of payment and the component of compensation that was most tightly connected to the individual performance. That was one finding. But another finding that I also take quite seriously is that the impact of organizational policy change, payment system change, had a kind of varying impacts across different groups of employees. Young employees were more affected than older employees, in a way that the gender pay gap amongst young workers, workers who are below 40 years old, was the largest. So young women basically suffered more than older women when the organizational compensation system changed. And then in the context of the Japanese organizations that I analyzed, the gender pay gap for managers kind of decreased after the adoption of merit-based pay. But I am a little cautious about this finding, partly because we're talking about the Japanese context, where gender gap is one of the largest among all the OECD countries, and gender gap is really large. There are only 1.4% of managerial jobs are assumed by women. So there are only so few women in the data that I analyzed. So for those very selective group of women in managerial positions, payment system shift to merit-based compensation system was an equalizer. So the gender gap for managers decreased after companies adopted merit-based systems.
So, well, the the managers that's the place where the gender gap decreased. That's also the place where the people might be running the merit-based system, or who, right? So it's been interesting.
It's true.
Right? Maybe there's more intention there, but it's also such a small 1.4%. That's really, really tiny. So I see where the thrust, the bulk of your analysis is about the young managers, the young, and the overall about the bonuses. With the young, was it just the bonuses, or was it the other parts of?
All the three components of compensation that I analyzed: bonus gap increased, gender gap in bonus increased. Also, the gender gap in base pay increased. The gender gap in the total compensation also increased. So basically, for young women, when the company that they work for switched to merit-based system, they saw more gender gap than just people who were older in the company.
So how might we make sense of this pattern of findings?
So one thing that is likely to be happening is that when a company sort of changes organizational policy, we're talking about compensation policies, one of the most important policies or employment policies of workplace. It might be difficult to apply this new compensation system to everyone, particularly those people who have been managed under the previous system for a long time. So many times it is the young workers who are getting into the company, just recently got in, or they are just signing their contract. Now they decide to apply this new merit-based system to these young workers who have not been exposed to the previous employment system, previous payment system. So it is very likely that even when the company said that we adopted the merit-based pay system, those people who are actually affected by the new system is likely to be the new workers who just signed the contract. So that's one, I think, very likely possibility, and why I found that the impact of the payment system shift was the largest on young workers.
And also, what the base pay and the base pay not really changing, or the gender gap not being affected by the merit-based reward systems, but the bonuses. What do you have a sense of why we might think that would, or what we might think that would make sense of that finding?
So base pay is more sticky in a sense, although it is not always the case. That's why I highlight the organizational variation, because in some companies, base pay is also affected by many other things and then changes. But it is mostly the bonus component of the compensation that's more kind of variable, more volatile in a sense. Like performance pay in particular tend to be tied to the bonus part of it, because it changes depending on how they perform, depending on how the company performs too. So bonus is mostly kind of considered as the variable component, the most variable component of the compensation. So that's why it's likely to be the case. And in many companies, base pay oftentimes doesn't change, even if individuals' performance level changes. Base pay just stays as a fixed part of the compensation. That happens quite a lot. Although it is often said that high performers can negotiate, and they are probably the only group of people who have the power to negotiate, to increase base pay based on their performance. But it is not too easy, because employers are they're unwilling to increase base pay, because it's kind of fixed component of the compensation. Once base pay increases, then they cannot go back and retract it. So it is mostly the variable component of the compensation, which is bonus pay, that is tightly connected to the performance.
How does one get a high bonus? I mean, in other words, is everyone doing the same job? Like we're all, I don't know, I'm trying to make up a job, but we're all building, designing a building. We're designing some building. We're all designing the same building. And so we're all just or is there any kind of way that, how does one maneuver oneself into position to really have a chance to perform well and get is there no maneuvering, or is it just kind of random, the assignments you get? I mean, how does it, and do the assignments matter, essentially, is what I'm asking.
So that's basically where the big question mark about performance and performance evaluation and performance pay in general cuts in. Because so how do you actually measure individual performance in, for example, team-based work and things like that? So it actually is a pretty big challenge to the performance evaluation, performance pay in per se. Let's say there is a finance industry and finance company, and the performance is actually measured based on the number of customers they found during the past quarter or something like that. It's kind of like a piece rate system. So you can actually count how many people you actually recruited as a customer, or depending on the size of the deals that you made, like how much money did you actually attracted for you to invest if you are in an investment company. Something like this. There are some industries that are actually, more friendly in a sense to that kind of quantification of individual performance. So that's one thing. But even if even when individuals are working in the finance industry, your question is still pretty relevant. The studies have shown that performance pay actually is the most dominant kind of ideology in reward systems in finance industry. But people in finance industry have already found out and complained about that individual performance is not as big of a determinant than like team performance or company performance even. And the kind of tasks that are given to each individual is a lot more bigger of a determinant than how well this individual performed. Even when all these individuals got exactly the same performance reviews and got full score of performance evaluation sheet, if the person's team does not have the kind of flow of good deals, then everyone in this team, even when everybody's high performer, they just cannot get as much of bonus, as much of performance pay. Then those people in the next team who always get big deals as a pretty sound and healthy flow of healthy deals in the same company. So there is a variation across teams depending on what kind of test basically they are assigned to. So that's another reason why performance pay does not necessarily lead to gender equality, because assignment also matters. If men and women are assigned to different kind of tests, and test assignment is sort of kind of susceptible to in-group favoritism or biases, it sort of gets factored into the actual outcome of compensation, because they just cannot get good deals. So there are multiple paths that will lead gender inequality in pay, even when objective, formalized performance evaluations and performance pay systems are introduced.
So if I understand, it's sort of that by moving to a merit, I can now see why the merit-based pay system is connected to an increase in the gender gap in bonuses, because it then makes it gives more power to these other kinds of connections that get people assignments that might not be equally
basically men and women might not have equal access to those good assignments that are going to give them an opportunity to achieve well enough that they'll get a higher bonus.
That's absolutely a very important path to gender gap. And I think I didn't really answer your question earlier about why it will increase, why adopting a performance-based or merit-based pay system can increase gender inequality. I mean, it's like, isn't it a no-brainer in a sense? There are a couple of theories about this in the literature. Paradox of meritocracy is now one of the most important theories in this literature about merit-based payment system. That the fact that the organization has adopted merit-based system, the idea that the organization is already meritocratic, sort of gives a kind of a room for managers in particular to think that what they do is already meritocratic. The fact that they follow these evaluation schemes let them think that, let them believe that they have already fulfilled the important requirement to be meritocratic. And that sort of allows them to be doing what they have been doing, in a sense, like assigning these tests differently between men and women, and still using in-group favoritism without noticing it or unconsciously. But the fact that they have this system, they already have adopted meritocratic ideology in their organization, sort of lead them to think that they are fine, they are doing the right thing, and even sort of freely behave in an unequal way under the cover of meritocracy. So that's the idea of the paradox of meritocracy. Paradox, instead of reducing gender inequality at the workplace, sort of opens up a room for managers to just behave in an unequal way, distribute rewards in a more gender unequal way under the cover of the ideology of meritocracy. So that leads to an increase, paradoxically, rather than a decrease of gender equality.
Well, given your analysis, what would you say to a CEO or a policymaker who wants to support gender pay equity? What's the, are there any, there may not be anything, but are there any lessons or warnings or anything that you would give to them if they had an interest in reducing inequality in pay between men and women?
So there have been many warning signals. I'm one of many people who are interested in how the ideology or belief system of meritocracy is implemented at the actual workplaces, or even education system. So the idea that individuals have to be rewarded based on their merit and performance is just widespread. But ideology is one thing, and how it is actually implemented in the education system at the workplace is another. What we probably need to think about more seriously after observing all kinds of unintended or unexpected consequences of the rise of meritocracy, even increasing gender inequality in my case, in my analysis, is that what we need to pay attention is probably an actual substantive outcome. Having a practice of merit-based system may be great, but what we need to pay attention is not the fact that they have the payment system that is based on merit, they argue, but what is an actual outcome? Was there an actual betterment of gender equality? Did we see gender equality increasing? It's a substantive outcome that we need to pay more attention to, rather than sort of giving a lot of benefit of doubt to the fact that these organizations have adopted or have tried to be meritocratic. Actual meritocracy is not the act of having a meritocratic practice. The actual meritocracy is an outcome that men and women are getting more, being treated more egalitarian way, and actually getting rewarded in a more egalitarian way.
Well, Professor Mun, this is your analysis was a fascinating read, and I appreciate your work on this very important topic. And there's a lot of lessons and a lot of thought that you opened the door to. So I appreciate it, and I thank you for joining us and sharing your thoughts with us today.
Thank you so much for having me today.
Our final segment concerns the slow return of passengers to public transportation in what we hope is the wake of COVID-19. Print and broadcast media have reported nationwide declines in ridership in comparison to 2019, the last full year before the pandemic caused closures of businesses, schools, and other services. Many have speculated on the cause of the decline in public transportation ridership. For a sociological perspective on this developing phenomenon, I spoke with the University of Houston professor Kathryn Freeman Anderson.
Professor Anderson, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So news reports are indicating that a lot of metropolitan transit systems in the United States are having trouble getting passengers to return. Just to get us oriented first, what are the kinds of transit systems in metropolitan areas? What's the mix? Just in general, what are the kinds of possibilities, and how do they differ from one another? Just to get us grounded.
So depending on the size of the region, there might be various kinds of, I'm assuming you're talking about public transportation only. So there's typically a mix of rail, so either heavy rail or light rail, and then also bus transportation, and then some locations have different sorts of at-grade other kinds of transportation, like streetcars or even buses that are kind of set aside like streetcars that have dedicated lanes or dedicated routes, but typically those are at the same grade or at the same level as you would see cars, and are sometimes subject to the same traffic that cars would be subject to. But we typically observe different kinds of ridership of the different sorts of transit that are available in regions. Not all regions have all of them. Bus is more common than any kind of rail, mostly because it's easier to put buses on the ground and it doesn't require built infrastructure to keep them going in the same way that rail does. But bus ridership tends to be of lower socioeconomic status, in large part because the ridership, to ride is cheaper generally than what we see with rail. And rail ridership, not everywhere, but generally, we find that that fares to use rail are more expensive, and oftentimes are, when transit systems are targeting ridership, they're kind of placed in more affluent areas and things like that, and have typically a higher SES clientele. But of course, all of this depends on the goals of the region. So different regional transit authorities or metropolitan transit authorities may organize these different systems differently. But that's kind of the broad patterns that we observe.
And I imagine, well, first, let me ask, heavy rail and light rail. I've heard this before. There's probably some technical or analytic distinction. Can you clarify that a bit?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if I remember. Yeah, I don't know if I remember the technical specifications for what specifies heavy versus light rail. But heavy rail is what you think of as being a train, but that carries people, whereas light rail, it's the grade of the rail and kind of the capacity that it can take. And so I'm sure I don't know exactly what the specification is, but it's what it sounds like. So the, trains can typically, have a much larger number of cars and things like that, because it's actually using set aside heavy rail lines that have a wider gauge in a kind of a similar lines that what you can see even like freight trains riding on and things like that, whereas light rail is not. It has a smaller gauge smaller, lighter cars, and they may or may not be at grade level with the street.
I see. So then my other question was, given what you had just said about the socioeconomic differences between average level of bus ridership versus rail ridership, I would imagine that once the rail system gets built, it may get built in a particular, with a direction, and it may pass various neighborhoods of varying socioeconomic statuses and have stops in those. But at some point, gentrification might occur that it just crowds out. But maybe that's not part of the process. I mean, I can imagine also people might, designers might sort of have the zigzag through neighborhoods to get the ridership that they're seeking. But I mean, is there any? There may not be any evidence on whether one thing happens or the other, or.
Yeah, it's both actually. So yeah, the biggest distinction between rail and bus is that rail lines are fixed. Obviously, you can build more rail lines or go in different directions, but it's a much longer term planning process to put in a rail line, and they don't typically move them for quick reasons, right? You might have an overhaul of a transportation system overall, but typically what happens is you see lines added on, not taken away or moved, because it's so difficult, and especially if you're talking about anything that's below ground. So obviously those are much more expensive to build and are typically fixed. But we observe both. So we find that lines on average are put through more affluent areas to begin with. But then we also find that once a rail line is planned for an area, we see rents and housing values go up in those areas. Some of that depends on the region. So in areas where public transportation is considered to be more desirable, we see a higher premium in those areas for putting in a rail line. But because rail lines are typically more efficient, especially if it's light rail that's not at grade, heavy rail, or subway systems that are not mixed with street traffic at all, that they typically are more efficient, and they typically run more frequently than what we see with bus lines. Obviously, you can run bus lines as often as you want to, in addition to subway lines or light rail lines. But typically they run fairly frequently and are fairly efficient, especially if they don't mix with traffic at all. So for that reason, there's kind of a premium placed on rail lines, and they're fairly expensive to build because it requires so much upfront infrastructure. But we observe both things at play. So it's not just one or the other. So we observe kind of a differential allocation of those resources in the first place. And then also some studies have shown that, once a rail line is announced or is placed, or there's kind of a perceived benefit of it, we see housing values go up in those areas and, development around it.
So that's an important context for thinking about what is now being reported, that, as I indicated, passenger traffic has not returned to pre-pandemic levels in a lot of metropolitan transit systems in the US. The Wall Street Journal reported just recently that ridership in the 5 largest systems ranged between 25% and 55% of pre-pandemic levels. So I pulled down some data that they referenced, and I looked at the overall story, and it said that ridership is 32% of pre-pandemic levels for light rail. At the time, I was thinking, well, what is light rail? But now I have a better sense. 45% of pre-pandemic levels for bus, and 18% of pre-pandemic levels for commuter rail. And that's taking in all the systems. I was looking at the first quarter of the 2021 compared to the first quarter of 2019, not the future. So these appear to be large shortfalls. Any sense about what might underlie these kinds of patterns, this shortfall?
Yeah, so I think the main reason why people aren't using public transportation is fairly obvious, right? People are afraid to be around other people, and they don't want to get sick. And that's a fairly well-known pattern in the literature. So not just not just the COVID-19 pandemic, but that people are more susceptible to infectious disease when they use public transportation for fairly obvious reasons, right? That if you are exposed to other people, you are more likely to get infectious diseases. So I think that's, the obvious underlying reason of people being nervous about riding. But then also the other part of it is that people just aren't moving around as much as they used to. So if we look at more mobility patterns of both public transportation riders as well as, pre-pandemic car users, that people just aren't moving as much as they used to. So a lot of people's work arrangements have been kind of fundamentally rearranged such that they are much more likely to work from home, or at least partially, they're part of their work schedule may still be from home even now. That has changed somewhat throughout the duration of the pandemic. Obviously, when a lot of places were under strict lockdowns and a bunch of businesses were actually closed, or there was prohibitions on people being able to physically go into work unless they were an essential worker. That has changed quite a bit over the pandemic. But even now, we still observe that people aren't working in the office nearly as much as they used to. Some people have gone permanently remote. And then the other part of it is that people have also changed their lifestyles quite a bit. So when the pandemic hit, we saw people moving out into the suburbs in a way that they may not have wanted to before, because if they had to be in the CBD at 8 o'clock every morning, why would you want to live out in the suburbs? But if you no longer have that constraint, or if you changed your work, we know a lot of people shifted jobs in the pandemic too. And so people are just doing things in a fundamentally different way than they used to in terms of their travel patterns and work arrangements. And I think we just haven't seen, especially among those more professional workers or people who have the ability to work at home, we just haven't seen them bounce back. I will say, though, that essential workers have only changed their ridership patterns slightly. So there's been some reporting on the mobility and movement patterns and public transportation use among essential workers and areas that have large numbers of essential workers. And those patterns haven't changed nearly as much as what we've observed in more affluent areas or areas with a higher number of professional workers who have the ability to work from home.
So this issue of this changing mobility patterns, people basically being less mobile, is that driven as best we know? Or if not, what do we, what's the best indication or best sense we have? Is that being driven by purely the commuting change, or is it also people are doing fewer trips that would necessitate public transportation because they're just going less, they're using it less on off commute times, like, going to the theater, going to movies, going to a park, whatever people, do, shopping, because it's not just, it's there permanently. It's not only necessarily going to run on the weekend. Yeah. Or is it being driven just by the commute change?
So I think the biggest change is commuting. Most people's daily transportation needs do revolve around work, not other things. Although there are some differences across groups in terms of, pre-pandemic anyway, of how people behaved in terms of their travel patterns. But I think that part of the story has also changed quite a bit over the pandemic as well, because, early on, if you think like spring 2020, when virtually nothing was even open, there was nothing to even go to, right? So yeah, you weren't going to the theater on Friday because there was no open theater, right? And so I think for a lot of those more recreational or even shopping needs and things like that, people have changed their habits. Some needs like the grocery store, people are still more likely to do in person than other things, but we saw a shift to online shopping. Many stores were closed for a long time, especially depending on where you live. I'm in Texas, things weren't closed for that long, but I still think that, people were, or at least I did, I know, with, made different decisions about how I traveled and how necessary it was to go to certain places, based on the pandemic, even after things weren't closed anymore. So I think it's a kind of a rethinking of priorities, whereas you may use transit to go to work because work is necessary. You may be less likely to use transit for entertainment purposes because it's not necessary. You don't need to go out for those things, aside from all of the closures that we observed too.
So if ridership doesn't bounce back, and a lot of this is when you talk about the commute changes, actually, this is prior to this. So let me ask this question first. If we think about these commute changes, is this fundamentally about CBD, the Central Business District, downtown, white collar workers and big high rises and office space? But if you go further out, which is at least the places I know, I mean, the public transportation system is designed to bring people there and get them back out. But if you go to other areas of a city or a region, more decentralized parts, are we still, I mean, I know there may not be evidence yet or data yet on this, but the best we know, are we seeing similar patterns there of people not, a reluctance or resistance to going into the office or changing this 5-day work pattern to something less with at the most fewer days and maybe not at all?
Yeah, I mean, so there's kind of two parts to what you're asking is work fundamentally changed such that people have kind of permanently changed or rethought their schedules? And I think we are seeing some of that where people are just, and companies have allowed this because it actually has brought up, flexibility and productivity and things like that. Weirdly, everyone working from home didn't make productivity dip. I read a study a little while ago that said, people are taking more meetings than they ever were because they can do it on Zoom and it's pretty easy to facilitate. So I think some of this change is permanent in terms of a restructuring of how work is done in the United States. But I think the kind of first part of your question gets at a broader debate that has been happening in public transportation thinking for a long time is whether or not you focus your transit system on taking people from the outsides into the CBD and back at the end of the day, or whether or not the transportation system is really about circulating of people in a much smaller area, right? Whether or not you can efficiently move people around a much smaller area, but do so in a way that kind of shortens travel times or allows people to move fairly freely and efficiently throughout even, a fairly small area, as opposed to thinking about taking people from the suburbs in. And I think that's the thing that maybe will, I think that's the part of the debate that's going to change post-pandemic. Because I think it's largely the bringing people from the outside in that has changed post-pandemic times, that, those folks use it as a way to commute to work as opposed to a way to live life and get around and not be dependent on vehicles. So what we know is that people who live in, closer into cities and who are of lower socioeconomic status are more likely to need that daily getting around the city kind of transit, as opposed to that coming from the outside into the CBD kind of transit that is largely revolved around work and is really kind of almost suburban or at least outer city centric. And so I think that's what transit agencies are probably going to be grappling with in the years to come, is that they have built whole systems around this idea of bringing people from the outside in, but those are the people who dropped off first, right? Or the statistics that you had at the beginning of which type of transit was more likely to drop off, or which had the, more precipitous decline in use, is it's that rail coming from the outside in, because those folks were the ones who were able to quickly maneuver online and do their work from home. And I don't know if that's coming back in full force anytime too soon. So I don't know.
Well, if it doesn't come back, are the current systems as they're currently designed, and I even know if in San Francisco, planned expansions of the Bay Area rapid transit system, which is the subway system, are these sustainable with fewer riders? And if you have the magic answer for yes, and here's how would that be sustained, or what's the response that's going to have to happen?
Yes, it's not sustainable. I think most have gotten by in the pandemic just because of provisions in the CARES Act and things like that have allocated funding toward these systems that were really hurting in the pandemic. But I don't know if that's going to be enough going forward. It'll be interesting to see with the infrastructure bill how that might change some of this. But I think transit agencies are going to, and some of them are. I mean, I've read news stories or, agency reports of like Houston, for example, is doing this, of kind of rethinking, how they're organizing their transit and where their transit goes and what it looks like. And actually spending a little bit more time on the bus infrastructure as opposed to rail, because bus lines are so nimble, right? That and actually, this is what most of them did in response to the pandemic, is that they kind of rethought bus lines and ways to move people around in a way that made that inner city circulator more efficient, as opposed to thinking about bringing people from the outside in. And this has been a debate for a long time in public transportation, folks. It's kind of where you put your money. Is it a hub and spoke system where you focus on the burbs, oriented toward the CBD, or whether or not you focus on circulating people. And I think we've seen some already start to do that, or kind of rethink, how they would do that. The BART system in San Francisco is a great example of this. It takes you twice as long to get from the one side of the peninsula to the other side of the peninsula as it does to get from Oakland to the peninsula, right? And it's because it's oriented towards these lines that go out in different directions and are able to pull people into the CBD. But it's not a great system if you're already on the peninsula and you want to maneuver efficiently around the peninsula. That it relies on a lot of at-grade, in traffic streetcars or buses, and they run 20-30 minutes apart and things like that it's just not designed to circulate people efficiently. And so I think if transit systems are going to be sustainable without government intervention, like they got in the federal government intervention that they got in the pandemic, that I think places are going to have to rethink how they do their ridership and who their riders are, as opposed to thinking about how to move people from the burbs in. But I mean, who knows, with gas at $4 plus a gallon, maybe everyone will be back on the bus.
$5.28 in San Francisco these days.
Okay.
But that's a short hope. Possibly that's a short-term shock. But the long-term trend is, you would say that it's, as you're saying, that they're going to have to rethink their systems.
I think so, and some already are. So I think that's and it wasn't just the pandemic. I think the last few years have brought questions of equity to the fore as well. So I think this tension in public transportation and among urban planners of like, who are you designing this for and who does this benefit? These are not new questions, but I think with a lot of the kind of social turmoil of the last few years, and more attention to kind of thinking about equity and thinking about how to do, as a public good, right? This isn't provided by the private sector. These are public goods, and who should it benefit and why and under what circumstances? I think some of that has come to the fore more in the last few years too, is not just thinking about what's the kind of best way to do this from an efficiency or an urban planning perspective, but also thinking about who does this benefit and what are the kind of implications or social implications of that when thinking about equity in workers and who this does and needs to benefit.
Well, Professor Anderson, these are transformative times, and this is a potentially, and this is certainly this the pandemic has thrown a lot of things up in the air, even something as already in place as rail systems. So I want to thank you for helping us with your insights on how to think about this and what kinds of issues are in play. And I appreciate your coming on and sharing it with us today. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
That's This Week in Sociological Perspective. We'll be back next week with another interview with an author of some important sociological research and more sociological insights on an issue in the news. Till then, take care.
This Week in Sociological Perspective is produced and directed by Samuel Roundfield Lucas. Ocean Reflections theme by Levihica and musical intermezzo by White Wolf, both at www.ccmixter.org. Video recorded interviews via Zoom. Transcriptions by Rev.com. This has been an Agency Structure Productions presentation.